last 15 years working in New Orleans to try to reimagine the education system, which has been no easy feat for many of us. But well before then, I was like many 22-year-olds graduating from college a long time ago, very unclear what to do with my life, not sure what I wanted to be when I grew up. And yet I knew that education had played a fundamentally important role in my own life. I was raised by a single mother who herself was an educator, who made sacrifices throughout her entire life so that I could have access to a higher quality education. And I grew up in a community very far from New Orleans. In fact, I grew up in a very small northeastern section of the Bronx, which is a borough of New York City. And grew up in a community where the dreams of many of the parents were much larger than their paychecks and their pocketbooks, and they relied on a public education system to help transform the lives of their own children, and yet the education systems in my own community were failing us in every way. And so my mother made the difficult choice to send me to schools outside of my own community, and I commuted over an hour throughout most of my elementary and middle school experience to go to better schools outside of my community. And when I got to high school, a friend of my mother's told her, where Kira goes to high school will probably impact her whole life, which seems quite high stakes. And so you have to choose wisely. So I ended up applying to and luckily getting into a very elite private school, which is one of the top schools in all of the United States. And while I had gotten everything right to that point, I had gotten A's from kindergarten to 8th grade. If there was an extra credit assignment, I did it. Teacher told me to do something, I did it. I went above and beyond. When I got to high school and I entered into the 9th grade, no longer did my A's translate to that environment. So while I had done everything right, I was not prepared to compete with students that had gotten that quality of education throughout the entirety of their educational careers, and I spent 4 years holding on for dear life. My 13-year-old self couldn't make sense of what was actually going on. In fact, I mostly blamed myself. What hadn't I done right? Why wasn't I prepared? Why wasn't I smart enough? Now I know, having spent my entire adult life working to disrupt some of the most challenging educational issues facing students in my own community and communities like my community across the United States, I now know that that wasn't necessarily my fault, that it is possible in America to do every single thing right and still find yourself on the wrong end of the education inequity gap. And that is what ultimately led to me deciding to join Teach for America, which is an organization that's committed to recruiting some of the country's most promising future leaders, individuals who are going to be leaders regardless, and compelling them to commit to teaching in some of our country's most challenging schools across the United States, and based on that experience, beginning to fight for the rest of their lives to become advocates, to fight for their children and children like their children who often don't have access to those kinds of opportunities. And so I joined Teach for America, and I was placed in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. Before then, I had never been south of Atlanta, so it was quite the cultural shock. And yet, I fell in love with my 4th graders very quickly. And I saw a couple things as a classroom teacher teaching in the South. I saw very quickly that my students had endless capability and limitless potential. I mean, I think about students like Matthew Anderson and Napoleon Pack, who were so curious and had so much to, they wanted so much of their own for their own lives. And yet I was equally baffled and at times heartbroken by the kinds of challenges that had very little to do with my students and everything to do with the system that they were operating in that ultimately almost guaranteed that they would have very limited opportunities to actually achieve their goals. In the state that I worked in, which is not dissimilar from the country that I was ultimately working in, we know with over 90% accuracy the likelihood of a child successfully graduating from college in kindergarten simply based on their zip code. So the likelihood that a Matthew Anderson would ever sit in this room is almost near impossible without a radical disruption to the way the system is currently working and a radical disruption to the trajectory of his life. And ultimately, what I found out as a classroom teacher is that you can make a tremendous impact as a classroom teacher, yet the challenges go well beyond the walls of the 4 classrooms. They are systems challenges, they are policy challenges, ultimately they are leadership challenges. And so when I was completing my 2nd year, I decided that I was going to stay in education, but ultimately decided to move on to the administrative level and decided that I wanted to be an administrator in New Orleans. And I became an administrator in New Orleans in 2007. And in 2007, 2 things had happened already in New Orleans. The first is 2 years earlier, our city experienced the most radical tragedy and disruption that I think any urban city in America had ever faced to date, where over 90% of our city had gotten flooded through Hurricane Katrina, including our education system, which was 80% underwater. All right. We also had several reforms starting to happen already across the city prior to Katrina that was really about leadership. Individuals who had stepped up to start to disrupt the system and start to reimagine the role that government can play in moving out of the way and empowering educators to be able to focus on the work of students instead of focusing on the work of implementing what bureaucrats who are further removed from them can want to accomplish for children. And so both the policy changes and this massive disruptive force of Hurricane Katrina created a unique moment in time where as an urban city, we had an opportunity to basically reimagine an entire education system, right? This is an education system that 10 years earlier produced students like Bridget Green, who was the valedictorian of her high school, a high school that was in downtown New Orleans, serving over 2,000 children, graduating 2,000 children a year. And this valedictorian who had done everything right, it took her 6 attempts to pass successfully the basic requirement graduate exit exam. 6 attempts, even as the highest performing student in her senior class, simply because of the fact that she was the top of her class, yet didn't have the basic skills to actually graduate. And the thing that was shocking about that when it happened 10 years earlier was really there was deafening silence. There were no riots in the streets. Nobody did anything to sort of say, listen, this must stop. Things went on as usual, mostly because a lot of people just felt this is the way it's always been, this is the way it's going to be. And yet here we are, 10 years later, facing a unique set of circumstances where as a community, we have a series of choices to make about whether or not we're going to step up and reimagine our education system. Here we are today, 2015, and we've become one of the fastest improving education systems in all of the country. In fact, on every major metric, from graduation rates, to college entrance exams, to successfully making it to and through college successfully, our students are actually demonstrating that it's absolutely possible. Particularly the African American students in our community, as a demographic, are actually outpacing other groups of students across the state of Louisiana. And in 10 years' time, our city has gone from being last in the state in terms of academic achievement to cutting that gap in half. So I think most other communities are sort of looking to New Orleans and asking, how is this possible? How is it that you've been able to disrupt an entire education system? And as I've mentioned, there were leaders who have been thinking about this for a really long time, such as Leslie Jacobs, who is an incredible policy leader, and lots of entrepreneurs who were thinking about how to reimagine education once, when we had such a challenging set of circumstances, given the fact that 80% of our entire education system was underwater. But I think what I wanted to make sure that I had the chance to really illuminate today was just more so than anything else, I believe that what matters more than anything else is how we position our leaders to basically lead through that kind of disruptive change. What does it require at the mindset level, and what does it ultimately require of them at the skill level to be able to navigate that kind of change to lead to dramatic gains? And there are a couple of things I've seen, having had the chance to work with thousands of leaders now over the city over the past decade. And some of these may be surprising because there are, of course, all of the technical skills that you need to lead this kind of change. But mostly the thing that's been interesting to me is all of the adaptive stuff that leaders need to be able to prepare their students to be able to sit in a room like ours in the future. The first is the ability to actually look for the good in their students. It seems quite basic, but it's actually really difficult, particularly as teachers, where you can feel like you are the holder of knowledge and your students are the receivers of knowledge. We teach our teachers that ultimately every student in your classroom will be a future leader. Right? And because they will be a future leader, you have got to create all of the systems in your classroom, all of the ways that you think about educating to be focused on what your students can actually teach each other and what they can teach you. And that's culturally responsive teaching at its core, and ultimately a big part of what we think will enable our students to ultimately lead the city one day, which is what we're aiming for. The second has to do with ensuring that our teachers are able to unpack their own privilege and understand the inequities that they themselves have benefited from, having graduated successfully from college, in many ways having access to way more means than any of the students we ever reach, helping them understand the role that race, class, and identity ultimately play in their mindset, in the way they look at the world, so that they can actually be able to relate to their students better, and that they are actually prepared to teach, to fight for inequity for the rest of their lives, because they themselves have actually done the level of reflection they need to understand the role that they play in perpetuating inequity, which is actually not something that a lot of people want to face, and it's not always an easy thing to talk about with beginning teachers or emerging leaders, yet we find that that is such an important part of what actually anchors our teachers and our leaders in being able to really fight and persevere for students in the kinds of challenges that we've had to persevere towards in the last several years. And finally, what we're learning is that no one does this work alone, that there is ultimately a culture that we have to build around the educators in our city, the leaders who are working to move students forward in our city, that is really focused on a culture of stronger together. That's what we call it, at least, which is, at the end of the day, you're gonna wanna quit every single day. A child will challenge you every day, and you will wanna quit every single day. What's going to get you to stay in the arena long enough to make the kind of transformational change that we expect you to make is going to come from having deep personal ties with someone else or several other people who are going to be able to reflect to you who your best self is when you can't remember it yourself. And so when teachers come to our office and they say, like, this is the hardest thing I've ever done, and these are like top graduates who have achieved more in their lifetimes than most people, and they're being challenged by a 6-year-old who doesn't care that this person was the valedictorian of Harvard. They don't care. Basically, what gets that teacher to go back into the arena the next day and stay in this for the next 15 years, which is what we need them to ultimately do, not just as teachers, but as system disruptors, is to have somebody else who knows them so well that they could call them out on who they are at their best and get them to show up again the very next day. And if we don't have that in place, we actually find that teachers won't stay, right? The challenges are just too significant. So, we're 10 years in now. We have a long way to go. We have been able to become the first urban system in the country that has been able to eradicate all failing schools across the city, right? Which is a shame that less than 10 years ago, 60% of our schools were failing, right? So we've lifted the floor substantially. We now have the average school in New Orleans is a mediocre school, right? How do you get a system from being a mediocre school to a world-class education system that is preparing all children to be the kinds of leaders that would produce the next wave of innovation that we need in this country and in this world? That's what we're aiming for, but we've learned how to get from the very bottom to mediocre. Now we're trying to get from mediocre to the very, very best. And we think that ultimately we have the pieces to do it. I personally believe that more so than anything else, it will come down to deeply committed, highly capable leadership that is able to actually be grounded in the kinds of challenges that are facing our children, know how to reflect on their own identities, and have the level of perseverance and, frankly, courage to persist when they actually want to take a different path, which is in the kinds of challenge, work that lots of our educators do, inevitably will be a part of what they feel, and we need them to actually move beyond that. So that's a little bit about what we've been doing and why I'm so inspired by it. I think that ultimately it's an honor to be able to be here because, to be totally candid with you, growing up in the Bronx, growing up in an inner city community, I would have never thought that I could even sit in a room like this or speak in a room like this. This was not something that I ever saw for my own life. And having had the chance to go to institutions like Harvard University and Horace Mann, which is my high school, where I got to be with other students who, from the time they were born, they knew they would be in rooms like this. Right? They knew, it was written. It was a part of their life's path. That wasn't the truth for me. And so I'm inspired by what it means to create the kinds of educational opportunities for children using technology and innovation, but ultimately like believing in people and cultivating leaders to get to a world where being in a room like this is what our children actually expect of themselves. And that is where we need to go, and that is a big part of what our work is about. So thanks for hearing a little bit about it. Yeah.
I have a question, but before that, I want to thank you. You really are an inspiring leader, and dedicate the time to this is phenomenal.
Thank you.
I sit on a board of a nonprofit in New York, and one of the things that New York systems have found is the impact of health on education.
Yeah.
And so the fact that students fall asleep in class because they suffer from asthma or they don't have glasses and can't read the board.
Yeah.
Are you seeing the same?
We are.
And how are you dealing with it?
We are. I mean, we're seeing that the majority of our children they have so many secondary issues associated with poverty and also associated with being the first generation in many cases that are going to school after Katrina. And so there's a lot of secondary trauma associated with that. I think the reason why I'm so invested in a mission like Teach for Americas is because it assumes that we can't put the whole burden simply on classroom teachers. Right? We continue to raise the stakes, and I believe in high standards for teachers, but ultimately, these are systems challenges that need to be addressed at every single level, which is why leadership at every single level matters. And so I've been really encouraged to see the kinds of leaders who are choosing to go into fields like healthcare and like public policy. Myself, 4 years ago, decided to run for public office. Painful experience, but was successful and now sit on a state board of education as well. And recognizing that at 30,000 foot, a policy level, we are still making decisions that impact children every single day, classroom teachers every single day. So we really do need leaders at all levels to disrupt their parts of the system if we're ever gonna change things at scale for children. Anyway, thank you very much.